Hello. Welcome to this 1-hour webinar. We are pleased by your interest in today's topic, bridging intergenerational gaps within ethnic immigrant churches. Dr. Ben C.H. Kuo is the main speaker of today's webinar. Welcome, Ben. Now, to briefly introduce, Dr. Ben Kuo is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Windsor, Canada. Dr. Kuo is a Taiwanese-born Canadian and a registered and practicing psychologist in Ontario. He has over 27 years of clinical experience working with and treating diverse individuals and families, including international students, immigrants, refugees, racial/ethnic minorities, and non-minority individuals in North America and in Asia. Dr. Kuo and his family currently attend Lakeshore St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Windsor, Ontario, where he serves as an elder. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be invited to share with you today's topic on bridging intergenerational gaps within ethnic immigrant churches. And I understand that we have 36 participants from really across the continents. So it's really very exciting to see that so many of us are interested in this topic. And I understand that some of our colleagues actually join us from Australia. My understanding is that you are about 6 o'clock there. I hope either you have had a good breakfast or that there is a good breakfast waiting for you afterwards. So welcome. What my hope through today's short time we have together really is to get this conversation started. This is a huge topic, so I don't think we'll be able to address many interesting thoughts, questions, challenges that we face related to the topic of ethnic immigrant churches. But I hope that this will be a good starting point and a good point for us to make connection. So I'm gonna, in my next few slides, I just wanted to start out with some highlights. And I'm not gonna assume participants that coming to this webinar have necessary familiarity with this topic. I know there's a variability across the board. Some of you are working in this field for many years and working in multi-ethnic churches or immigrant ethnic churches. Some of you are simply interested in this topic, wanted to learn more. There's a wide range of spectrums of interest. So I just want to start with something, sort of the basic highlights, and then hopefully this will generate thoughts for our discussion later on. So when I think about intercultural ministry, this is the story, this is the verse that came to me in this scripture, where we read Jesus' conversation with Samaritan woman. So I wanted to highlight this because I think we want to situate why we are talking this topic, why this webinar within a framework of the purpose of the intercultural, groups relationship and the meaningful ministry. So here in John 4:7-39, we read that Jesus had this conversation with a Samaritan woman that was not culturally sanctioned or appropriate in Jesus' time. It reads, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" Verse 25, the woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. And then later on the chapter in verses 39, we saw the results. Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So in that, this particular story in the Bible reminded me that Jesus was a wonderful example of someone who crossed boundaries. This scripture shows that he's crossed boundaries, set an example as in the gender role boundary, a man and woman cross ethnic and cultural boundary between Jews and Samaritans, and also gives a sense the boundary between God himself and conversation with human being. So with this spirit, I think it makes a lot of sense to think about in terms of boundaries within ethnic churches. So I want to start by highlighting some of the realities faced within ethnic immigrant churches. And for one thing, even though the topic we're talking about today is intergenerational, when you are talking about an ethnic immigrant church, intergenerational issues are never about intergenerational. For example, in most cases in families or churches, non-ethnic churches, is about independence, children growing up and striving for their autonomy. But that example, when put into cultural context within the ethnic immigrant churches, it has that cultural piece, the cultural expectation of roles, social roles and family relationship, and so on and so forth. So intergenerational issues are related with intercultural issues. And then congregational life is intertwined with family and social relationships or dynamics. It's not about just congregation together, but in a church, an immigrant church, there are multi-generations and most likely from the same families. And so the relationship within the family, the interaction patterns also play out in the congregational life. The other level of the reality of the ethnic churches are spirituality intersects with cultural dynamics. So the interpretation of faith, expression of faith is impacted by cultural experiences and differences between first generation immigrants, typically parents, and their second generation children. So these are some of the realities, and these are realities shaped by other forces that are embedded in the sociocultural and the contextual, larger contextual context of immigrant, particularly in this case, I'm talking about Asian immigrant churches. So I want to highlight a few things. One is acculturation. And for those of you who have the opportunity of reading the chapter that I share with you that was forwarded to you, you'll see that one of the things that immigrant churches face is the level of learning about the culture of the host society between first generation and the second generation. Typically, second generation learned the host language, English, French, in the Canadian context much faster than their first generation parents. So there are those cultural learning differences, speed of which between first and second generation. And then within the Asian ethnic immigrant churches, there's also this intrinsic cultural influences from one's heritage, Asian feminism and traditionalism, things like Confucius ideology, filial piety. One is expected to be pay respect to one's parents and take care of them, and the parents are supposed to take care of their children when they're young. That kind of reciprocal relationship, social hierarchies, obedience from the parents to, the children from to their parents are all part of that expectation that are defined culturally within Asian families. So then there's another force that is acting on immigrant families, immigrant churches, is transnational migration or immigration experiences, where first generations usually is in the position of trying to preserve heritage culture, and second generation more moving toward integrated to the dominant culture. The fourth element of the challenges the immigrant churches face is financial resources and independence, or the lack thereof. And here I'm referring to a church with first generation and second generations congregants. Typically, second generations are depending on, in terms of resources financially, on their first generation congregant. So the ability to be self-sufficient is more difficult when you don't have those resources. People have talked about different models of ethnic minority or ethnic immigrant churches. And here I'm citing Shin and Saucer's definition. And they talk about 4 possible models. One is room for rent model, where second generation, so I imagined they're young, they're adolescents, they're immigrant children, sharing the same church and worshiping together with first generation being in the leadership position. So it's child-parent relationship. It's like children have a room in a house. Then there's a duplex or triplex model, whereby second generation, first generation side by side worshipped together. But the senior leadership is under the first generation. So I see this tenant, second generation, and landlord relationship. This is how I kind of imagine. Triplet in the sense that there could be multiple, more than 2 congregants within the same church. So you could have a Taiwanese speaking congregant, English speaking congregant, and Mandarin speaking. And sometimes you might even have a Cantonese speaking in the case of Chinese churches. And then another model is townhouse model, where second generation and first generation worship side by side under the same roof within the same church, but with separate and individualized leadership. So I imagine this is more like neighbor to neighbor relationship, much more equal, much more balanced kind of relationship. And then there's another model where it's called commune or model or open house model, some people call. And pancultural churches or multi-ethnic churches. I'm putting question mark here is because I know there are some large multi-ethnic churches now occurring in some parts of North America and elsewhere. And a lot of people are thinking, particularly right now for those churches with first and second generations are asking what their future of the church would look like. Would this be something multi-ethnic for them in the future? Is this a feasible model? So these are potential models that we can think of, the relationship between first generation and second generation. There are some common challenges associated with ethnic immigrant churches, and I just want to quickly highlight. Clearly, one of the things that come to mind is the difficulty with communication. Having first generation, second generations worship in different languages, even negotiating, communicating probably in languages not perfectly fluent in the other group's language. So language barrier is one aspect, even though there could be even communication patterns difference. One group might be more direct than the other much more reserved, much more so indirect, that sort of thing. So communication differences, and here we're talking about cultural differences between 2 generations. Divergent value and worldviews, priorities in life. The acculturation gap we talked about earlier. The speed of identifying and learning about the culture, the value, the practice, the language of the host culture differ between the parents and their children. Cultural identity, the affiliation, first generation oftentimes still have that part of their identification with their home culture Korea, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, wherever that might be, are still very strong. Second generation might be it could be bicultural in between, or that they are completely Western in the context of Canada or US or Australia or Britain, that they want to identify with more the mainstream, the host culture. And there's also, this translates into divergent views in worship style, visions, and ministries and theology. And we can see, we have heard and have learned about where different generations, congregants have a different approach to theology. Some tend to be more liberal, open, and others become much more conservative, evangelical. So cultural differences, intergeneration differences can intersect with the expression of faith as well as the interpretation of their faith. And the other challenges that I'd like to share with you is that even though there are some the factors that happen between first generation and the second generation, there are also other societal forces that can be impacting on the future and the makeup of ethnic immigrant churches. One is the aging trend. So we are seeing in Canada anyways, and I think similar in the States, where there are many Asian Canadian churches, the first generations are getting older. And as a result, first generation congregant is diminishing in number. Second generation either stay on, or many have moved on to other churches, not staying with their heritage churches. So the trend of shrinking first generation congregant is happening because of results of aging. And this is related to the other issue at this greater external level, is immigration patterns. So again, with Asian Canadian churches, we're seeing diminished newcomers, new immigrants coming to Canada, for Koreans, for Taiwanese, churches for Hong Konger churches. These churches are seeing less and fewer Chinese-speaking, Taiwanese-speaking, Mandarin-speaking, Cantonese-speaking first-generation immigrant coming. So there are forces both in terms of the diminishing numbers of first generation due to growing old, as well as fewer immigrants coming. And so that has a great deal of implication on the future of ethnic minority churches, particularly for the first generation immigrant congregants. So I want to share with you, I just make the topic a little bit more lively, referring to some of the things that came out of our research that I've been participating. And also I talked about that in the chapters that has been shared with you. Some of the sentiment that we heard from some of the participants in our project called Challenges and Opportunities for Asian Canadian Immigrant Churches with first and second generation congregants. So I'm going to read two, just make these examples, our discussion much more alive. So one, by second generation Korean Canadian, I think the biggest challenge is the generational disconnect. Although being under the same roof is better than complete independence of EM, English ministry, there's a lack of common ground between the EM and the KM, bracket Korean ministry. Sometimes it feels like there are two separate entities under one roof. So even though together feel separate, is what this quote was saying. The next quote is from a Chinese Cantonese-speaking first-generation participant. They have a lot of conflicts with one another because they sort of have different values in a sense. Even though we are Chinese, but Cantonese and Mandarins, we come from different parts of China. So everything is very different. Again, under the same roof, but experience very different cultural perspectives. So I wanted to, in the last few minutes, to share with you some of my ideas, and there could be a lot of ideas about how to deal with intergeneration gaps. Here are some. First of all, I think we need to realize there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. So I think it would be helpful, first of all, to engage both first generation and second generation about thinking about the future. Wherever they are right now, what do they want to see their church in 20 to 25 years? I think that's a common ground that both can share and work together towards that goal, as opposed to thinking about right now. And thinking about right now in terms of how you translate it into where they want to be in the future. The other things that I like to suggest is that we seek, these churches consider seeking the assistant cultural broker for first and second generation. And what I mean by this is someone who understands both congregants, both culturally, spiritually, and relationally, kind of bring people together, like a mediators of sort. We know in cross-cultural, in the cultural training that I'm involved with outside the church, usually we need to have someone to become the cultural informant to help us understand the people, the company that we're moving into that's different in a different country, or clients who are different from a cultural, different cultural background. Some cultural mediators can help us bridge that gap. And the last point that I want to suggest is adopting a missiological mindset with second generation churches, planting and ministry. And this idea has been talked about, came 2019, is that a shift in our thinking that is not assuming that second generation are my children, therefore I know their background, their needs, nor should second generation assuming their parents' generation that they know very well because they watched their parents over the years. That we are actually don't know each other as much as we think we do. So if we have the different kind of mission mindset, if I'm thinking about provide ministry and church planting in a different culture, I want to learn the language of that group. I want to know the cultural value of that group and their needs. And if we assume that kind of from that position, I think it may help us to be able to be more, a greater humility, first of all, but also opens our eyes to want to learn each other. And I think that might be a ways to better bridge our intergenerational gap. So this might be a case where we can do intercultural training, mediation between the first and second generation. So with that, I'm going to end my part of the discussion, and for us now moving to a discussion of the cases. Pablo?
Welcome back.
We need more than that, more time.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
I mean, I want to go back to my group.
I'm speculating that Emo talked for the whole 6 minutes, didn't you, Emo?
Listener.
We only
All
got
right,
to
thank
we only
you.
got to introduce ourselves. That was it.
That was basically it.
Oh, okay. But I hope it was a time to get to know each other and have a little small chance to go deep to the conversation. Maybe can 2 or 3 people briefly share what they have discussed in your small groups? And for this, you may speak out, but just be brief. 2 or 3 people.
Robert Cousins here, Irish Canadian by descent. I just had a question when I read the paper concerning brokers, and I think the suggestion was that the 1.5 could be a broker because they're bilingual, they're bridging 2 cultures. You know, having worked in Africa for 12 years, my comment to that would be often in cultures, age is very important. And so even though someone is bilingual and familiar with 2 cultures, I think age and honor sort of trump the fact that they're bilingual. And so to put a 24-year-old in as a broker between people who are 50, 60 and people who are 20, I would be a little bit concerned in regards to the age factor and how that would be perceived.
And Robert, I think you raise a very good point. In the chapter, I suggest that as one possibility. And we all know in different cultural contexts, there are other characteristics that are important, valued, that are esteemed characteristics, right? So age, as you say, might be a real issue to some culture. So in that particular case, I would suggest think about someone who is 24 years old, 1.5 generation, but is a pastor, who is a well-trusted individual. And he or she not only has the cultural understanding, but also other credibilities. So, and I think different cultures ascribe different credibility to different people. It might be someone who is considered a professional, who has established experiences, a leader in the church, and that sort of thing. So I would suggest that that is one aspect. I think the point I'm trying to drive at was that obviously that need to be someone who has a good knowledge of both cultures to be the bridge, but there could be other important factors about that person's to earn the trust of first and second generations. So your point is well taken, absolutely.
During your presentation, one of our participants, Ren, said that the East Asian communities here look different from South Asian community, have different experiences. Maybe Ren, would you like to unpack that a little bit more? There's someone who would like to hear more about that.
Ren needs to be unmuted.
There we go. I needed someone else to unmute me, apparently.
There you go.
Yeah, I just wanted
Hi, Ren.
whoops, I can lower my hand. So hi, my name is Ren Ito. I am regional staff with the United Church of Canada. I mean, the examples were, that was partly just so that folks were conscious that as we talk about Asian experiences, we're noting that the examples that we were looking at were East Asian examples. And it is a very, I mean, even within East Asian communities, we have very different experiences, not just different experiences and different histories, but different intergenerational and intercultural dynamics within our communities. So for example, in a lot of my communities, Japanese Canadian communities, the issue wouldn't actually be a language barrier. There is a language barrier issue, which is a whole other thing, but even within Japanese Canadian communities that I would be able to fit into, the primary barrier that I would face would be around different histories of migration, which I know is true of other migrant communities as well. Depending on at what point you arrived in this country or your family or your community formed, you occupy a different place, and there are barriers for communication for being in community. For some, it's where you originated from in the land that you migrated from. In other communities, it's like straight up class. It's all sorts of things, and I think we need to be conscious of those different dynamics. And as we're conscious of those, the one thing I did want to note, and particularly for folks here who are doing intercultural work outside of their own cultural backgrounds, and especially for folks here who identify as white in North America, I do think the one thing we absolutely have to be clear about is that when we're talking about ethnic congregations or ethnic churches, like what we're basically saying communities of color, but we're leaving the white part of that equation out. And if we don't name that and we look at ethnic communities or ethnic congregations as sort of churches that have this extra layer on top of the norm, and that's the layer we need to look at and deal with, that actually isn't going to help us in any way to move towards becoming intercultural. I think we have to look at whiteness and white culture, dominant white culture, as part of that mix. So when we're talking about intergenerational issues with, say, second, third, fourth generation people in those communities who've grown up on this continent, what we're talking about is the ways that their culture of inheritance has mixed with the dominant white culture of this continent and this country. So I think we have to be really clear about naming that. Otherwise, we really will be treating these as sort of exceptional cases. And I don't think we'll actually get to the heart of some of the intergenerational dynamics and difficulties that we face.
Mm-hmm. So appreciate, Ren, your point. I think as we talk about any cultural dynamics, we do have to be mindful that there are truly a lot of cultural variations even within the individual groups. So I'm not particularly familiar with Japanese churches, but I would imagine in the case of Canadian context, probably with Japanese congregations, we're talking about third and fourth generations. I would imagine, and the example that I'm giving has really about first and second generations, and those are much more characteristics of the Korean churches, the Taiwanese churches, the Cantonese, and Mandarin-speaking churches. I think so being fully aware of those variabilities is absolutely important.
Here, Kevin wrote that we focus the use of a cultural liaison very useful both in the church and in the community. Jonathan shared that in our group, we talk about power and how that plays out differently in different cultures and different experiences of migration. And Marilyn's wrote that I find there's a difference too, whether you arrive as an immigrant by choice or as a refugee. And as when Ren mentions, also depends on the time of arrival. Now, yeah.
No, Paulo, I'm interested in hearing participants' experiences in terms of any success stories or positive experiences you have encountered, whether it's in your own congregations or with those congregations you know, in kind of improving the relationship between, and I'm coming back to use the first and second generation kind of example. Are there any positive, helpful, informative examples I'm wondering people would be willing to share based on that, what their personal encounters in the past or even present? Anyone?
Or sorry, what were you specifically asking about? Positive church situations and contexts?
Yeah. So if you know of any experiences that you know or you know of someone that dealing with the issue that we're talking about, particularly reaching second and first generation within the church context, what has been helpful that you are aware of?
Yeah, I can share about my own church. My own church is exactly that. Sorry, my name's Tim. I'm from Tyndale Intercultural Ministry Center, but I've been a pastor, local church pastor for 20 years in Toronto. Chinese church, classic Chinese church in Toronto, Cantonese, Mandarin, English congregations. Mandarin congregation experienced kind of what Ren was saying about diaspora groups coming at different times. Especially with the Mandarin congregation, we talk about the early Mandarin immigrants who were more came as international students, but more the recent Mandarin immigrants are of a completely different mindset and come from a different, even though it came perhaps from the same places in China, just that different few decades have made a dramatic difference in terms of who they are and how they've come to Canada as new immigrants. Anyways, what I wanted to share was, for our church, we the big sticking point was the presence of a senior pastor. So we did get to a point where all three congregations were about the same size. So size-wise, we were the same size in terms of voting capacity, in terms of financial support to the church. And so we actually went with a model where we didn't have a senior pastor because we kind of acknowledged, we're not saying that this is the perfect model, but we acknowledged that having a senior pastor, they would always have some sort of cultural bias, no matter how hard they tried or how sensitive they tried to be. So we ended up having 3 congregational leads as a shared leadership. And that's where I almost think about too, you know, when we talk about some sort of cultural liaison or a broker, sure, there's advantages to it, but they almost need to act in a team approach. So, you know, others have shared about quote unquote white privilege and naming that, and I get that. But as an example, I mean, I think oftentimes I've been working with Robert Cousins a lot for the last few years, and I actually think there's been so much power in the fact that Robert and I will walk into a room and we'll be both of different skin colors and obviously of 2 different diaspora stories. And when we walk into a room, we have that shared story and that shared opportunity to speak, not just from one perspective, but from a shared perspective. And I think about our own church where having 3 combined leads have been much more effective for us anyways. It hasn't been perfect for sure, and it takes a long time to talk about anything, but it's been much more, it's enabled us to address not marginalizing voices better than what we found in the past. Anyways, that's just a quick story. I mean, I can go on and on about that, but.
So Timothy, that sounds almost like the triplet kind of model that I was talking about earlier, where you actually have 3 sets of leaderships, right? I think Timothy was muted.
Yeah. Similar model. Sorry, yeah, I'm muted pretty quickly here, which is good and bad, right? Good and bad. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying, way to control the conversation. But yeah, for sure, it is a shared model leadership, shared model in terms of working together. The only thing I'll add to that was, you know, for our leadership, it was a very interesting situation where, I mean, I was the longest serving pastor at the time, which meant I knew the most. I knew the ins and outs of relationships. I knew the ins and outs of governance and operation. But I didn't have the title lead or senior pastor. And yet I was the youngest of the staff. So that made it complicated in itself. Our Mandarin pastor, who was the oldest in our church, and anything he said, pretty much everybody would go with. And luckily I agreed with everything he said. But he too didn't want the senior pastor title or role. And so it was an interesting dynamic because we did acknowledge the fact that he came with a lot of power just because of his age, but he was such a humble guy that he was able to just build genuine relationships. And between the 2 of us, we were good at just weeding out what was necessary, what was unnecessary. One of the case examples that I think I was reading was about, you know, just leading worship, you know, the song time during a joint service and stuff like that. And for us, that, you know, that hits home for a lot of multi-congregational churches where, yeah, I mean, just the song time becomes a hot debated conflict area of who's going to lead, how it's going to be led, what kind of songs be sung. Anyways, yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
We have Emmo who raised his hand.
Sorry. Yeah. What I want to add to the picture, and we're talking intergenerational, so often we think of just within the context of between 2 generations or 3, but in each generation is as you use the word acculturation, each generation acculturates very differently, not just per generation, but within the lifetime of that generation, and everybody goes through different stages and whatnot. I suppose what the question I have would be, when do we bring in the idea of, or the factor in contexts, as in plural, for each generation? Because it's not only generation having conflict with each other, but the context they're coming from or they're living within, say in the Canadian context, matters a lot when it comes to building, say, relationship within the church, or when you're sharing the same, well, I don't know if we share, power is shared between generations. I still have to see a church that has an immigrant church that has done that well. Often money, because it's the first generation who gives quite a bit of the finances to the church, they hold the power. And to shift that to the next generation is almost like, well, it'll never happen unless the next generations learn how to give more, or they give more than the first generation. So those are just one to put on the table.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to understand. So your question is, what's the role of the context in how it impact on different generations' experience with acculturation? Okay, so just based on, apologize if I don't get your point correctly, but this is what come to mind when I'm thinking about different generations having different context experiences with acculturation. So I can imagine first generation immigrants coming as labor or even as international students, say, with the Taiwanese community, because that's the community I'm from, have a different experience with discrimination as compared to their children. Their children will still experience discrimination, but it's different, qualitatively different. They wouldn't be laughed at because their accent. And I have 2 children of my own who are Canadian born. Their experiences are different from mine, and even from my parents' generation. So yes, I think as we think about individual separate generations, their experiences individually, I think even though they are supposedly from the same culture, and that's the point I think I'm trying to drive at, is this assumption that if we are all part of this church, ethnic immigrant church, we kind of understand, regardless of your generation, we kind of understand each other. We share similar cultural experiences, don't we? And the answer is maybe we should kind of switch around to say, maybe we don't. And if we don't know each other's acculturation experiences, their context, even though we kind of grew up together, we are raised in the same home, a church home, maybe we need to get more deeper down into, it sounds strange, but getting to know each other more deeply and take that assumption that I know you because you're my kids, or I know you because you're my parents, away. And maybe that would allow us to get a deeper and more nuanced understanding of each other, because we really don't know each other that well. And the quotes I share with you was based on our research. And I was just reading through these quotes, they sound very familiar, but I'm hearing that these, whether it's Korean Canadians or Chinese, Cantonese Canadians, saying that we don't know the other congregation all that well, to be honest. And we don't talk to each other all that well, or that much. So I think that might be a good way for us to understand, and this intercultural piece is important because maybe we don't know each other that well. Maybe we need to have greater, deeper conversation and even training or someone to bring us together. Anyway, that's my thought to Amos' thought.
Also, I want to recognize that there are people who are not involved in Asian immigrant churches, but they are interested to learn more about intergeneration, like Canadian, white Canadian churches also have questions. And Jonathan wrote this comment saying that, how does this process he says, and I think Ren touched on this, how does this process echo down the generations and continue to shape our churches? For example, my denomination had a large influx of migration in the years shortly after the Second World War. In my memory, our churches had worship in more than one language, no longer. I wonder how we responded to generational issues still is an unconscious part of the culture of my church. and how we deal with conflict decision making, how we respond to new members, etc.
Sorry, is that a more comment or is that more of a question? Is this from Jonathan?
Yeah, comments and also welcoming people who are not directly involved with immigrant Asian churches in Canada, but there are people among us who are also in Canadian white churches. And I'm wondering and asking to them, like, do you find what we're talking here, a similar dynamic happening? Is there some common grounds that you are observing? It's a question to you and to overall people.
Okay, yeah, it's just a quick point from me. I'm currently, for the last 16 years, I'm now elder at a church, predominantly quote unquote white Canadian church in the outskirts of Windsor. And I believe we're one of the 3 Asian family in a congregation of about 500. So I think my experience, and compared to my previous experience when I was very much part of the Taiwanese Presbyterian Church in Toronto with multiple generations, I think the difference is for the Canadian churches, when we look at newcomers, it's more of what can we do to help and to reach out. So for example, our church has sponsored Syrian refugees went in 2016 and 17 when it was a new wave of refugee coming in. And so that the mindset was different, is how do we reach, how does the church provide sponsorship in bringing and helping this newcomer into the congregation. And that seems to be a very important, but it's different dynamic than immigrant churches, where they're trying to struggles with how to accommodate each other. And I can imagine a Canadian church, if it's continued to grow with cultural diverse population coming in, I think those issues will become much more apparent. So anyway, I'm not sure I've addressed that question, but that's kind of just based on my own personal experience, comparing experience with ethnic churches versus, white Canadian churches, quote unquote.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and then we'll be ending. Anyone would like to ask final comments or question? Well, I have one question that I would like to throw and maybe end there, or maybe Ben can quickly answer to them. My experience as a second gen, we feel the need of change, that we have to be more in a mutual level, share leadership, be more into this intercultural community. But usually the people who have the passion, from my observation, from my small location, is that second gen. But the first gen are not aware of that. How could we then approach to them and tell them to have this different attitude, or find different way to engage with us? Where can we start in that kind of situation where first generation are still not aware of our need?
And I think, that is an issue that challenge, I think, most of multi-generation ethnic churches, is that usually second generation struggles with and trying to cry out to say, first generation, please listen, but it doesn't seem like it's impacting the first generation. So I'm coming back to my idea of cultural broker. I think we haven't really put this in practice. And I think if you think about, and again, I'm using the East Asian way, and as a psychologist, the way I deal with cultural conflict, it's quite different in a Western culture, where if you have a conflict, you go to someone who is supposed to be neutral, impartial, mediator to help you. And that individual has no relationship with the parties in conflict. But in the Eastern culture, it's about that person who's going to be the bridging needs to be someone who's both parties can confide their confidence in. And so I used to be quite open to use an example. I'm someone who I was a youth counselor for many years in my church in Toronto, Taiwanese churches. And I became the person who has become the cultural brokers because I know the first generations very well, speak the language, understand culture. But I came to Canada when I was an international student. I also have a lot of a good knowledge of the second generation issues. And I happen to be someone who has a high education, has well-respected status in terms of in the eyes of first generations and both generations. So I become a person that would play that role. So in different churches, there are different contexts. I think it'd be helpful to find out who are those people, either individual, group, or individual within your context who understand and have the credibility and trust of both groups to be the spokesperson to bring the two groups together. And that both groups feels like, yeah, I think I will listen to that individual, and that person could be the bridge, to be the broker, who are being trusted by both generation congregants. So that's one thing that comes to mind.
Thank you, Ben. It's 5:01. I would like to respect all your time. Once again, thank you, Ben, for your wonderful presentation and for facilitating this webinar. And also want to thank all the participants. This is our third in a series of webinars being offered by the Forum for Intercultural Leadership and Learning. In June 2020, we'll have another webinar for exact topic and dates. We'll let you know through our website. If you have a webinar topic that you want to offer, please let us know. And if you're interested to facilitate a webinar, please let us know. Lastly, if you want to sign up for our e-newsletter and learn more what Phil does, leave your contact information in the chat box or simply email me. Wherever you are, have a great afternoon or evening. Peace.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, everyone. Bye now. God bless.